For the past couple of years, there have been concerns, from myself included, that sort of the banks around the world, including the central banks, are sort of colluding to introduce sort of a new monetary system, a central bank digital currency that has a lot of sort of negative implications for us as civilians. Uh, there's actually a little more to that story, and it's not quite as simple as sort of George Carlin's us versus them. I'm going to break down for you what I have learned in this video. Here's a clip from George Carlin from years and years ago that I want to sort of talk about in this video.
And you know something? They'll get it. They'll get it all from you sooner or later because they own this fucking place. It's a big club, and you ain't in it.
I'll post the link to that full video. It's only a couple minutes of his full set, and I agree with him. And a lot of people who've kind of gone through an awakening in the last few years, if not longer, sort of have come to learn that things aren't necessarily as you're taught in school in terms of the role of government and why politicians are put in place and that type of thing. But the mistake that I concluded from George Carlin, which other people have concluded, is that there's one big club, that we're not in. So it's true that we're not in it, but there are many clubs. That's the challenge that we're going to talk about in this video. There are many clubs. They're kind of like the mob in that there are crime families that all have their various sort of areas of expertise and resources at their disposal and particular interests that they want to support. Honestly, if you've watched the show Game of Thrones, I think it's quite a great analogy for how these global cartels work. In Game of Thrones, if you've not seen the movie or read the books, they're essentially in this sort of fictitious land, all of these regions, and each region has its own sort of local leader, like the Lord of the Manor type, and citizens who live in that region. Each region's kind of known for its thing. There'll be like one that is on the ocean and they're like good at boat stuff and fishing, and they have a little navy. And then there'll be a faction in a more rural area. They will be good at farming and have industrial interests to protect. And then you'll have your sort of city one that has more commerce and banking and money type things. And what you kind of learn in that show, which is a fascinating series, is that each faction has interests, incentives, they have goals, and sometimes multiple factions, their interests will align and they'll kind of work together on something. But more often than not, these various factions will have issues with one another and they'll go to war, whether it's an actual kinetic war, whether it's more of a monetary trade type situation. Now, if you're kind of used to like sort of mafia movies, which I've certainly seen plenty of them, there's kind of a limit to the number of like theaters of war in that type of an environment. But when you're talking about the financial cartel, they have a lot more resources. They have governments at their disposal, lots of politicians. They own banks. They have businesses, large businesses, financial institutions that can be used to support the interests of the cartel. I have spent a long time, or kind of quite a bit of energy in the last couple of months. So this isn't something I just learned about yesterday. And this is sort of part of a thesis that I initially learned about from Tom Luongo that I have spent tons of time digging into. And at first I was quite resistant, and I'll explain to you why in a second. And so I asked a lot of questions. I was kind of a pain in the neck in that it didn't make sense to me how this one cartel that I had sort of assigned the label of basically like the demonic and the source of all evil, all of a sudden now they're kind of like in our corner. And so before I get into this breakdown of how this cartel works, what the various factions are that are fighting with each other currently, which dispels this sort of George Carlin thesis, I want you to just do one thing, which is suspend your need, because I have this need too, to assign anybody to the label of good or bad. Like, just for all intents and purposes for this video, they're all bad. They all do bad things. They all have interests that they're willing to sacrifice people for to meet their goals and their interests. And so we're just going to get lucky as random citizens that sometimes one of the factions of the cartel will inadvertently protect our interests simply because it supports their own interests. It's not really because they care about us. So when you let go of that, it's easier to see how this works and how this plays out, because I'm not going to try to convince you that like Jamie Dimon and JP Morgan are the good guys. They're not. I don't know him personally. I'm not saying anything about his personal characteristics. I just know that US commercial banks will pursue their own interests at the expense of other people, at the expense of other companies. And they've done that consistently. They've been, manipulating the gold market for a long time. They will shut down competition. We're also going to watch a video from Gary Gensler where he talks about how these commercial banks will slow down innovation in their field because it's a threat to their own monopoly. We're going to focus on the banking cartel for a while. And the banking cartel is old. It's been around for hundreds of years. My story my understanding of the banking world originally came from Creature from Jekyll Island, a book that probably influenced me more than most others. This book details sort of the start of banking back in Europe. I want to even say in like the 13 or 1400s, like a really, really long time ago, way before any of us were even remotely in existence. So this industry originated in Europe. And I might be wrong on some of this stuff because it might predate this. So and the old stuff doesn't really matter. I'm just kind of bringing you up to speed if you don't know much about the banking cartel in the US and kind of how it relates. So for what we're discussing today, the banking operations started in Europe and kind of created headquarters in London. The city of London is a fascinating thing if you've never been or don't know much about it, is that there's sort of this large area called London, right? Just like New York or Paris or whatever. Within this London is this very tiny I think it's like 1 square mile region that is called the City of London. Not to be confused with the city we refer to as London. It is literally called the City of London. And if you're in London, people will talk about it like as the city, which as someone who used to live in New York was kind of confusing for me because New Yorkers call the entire New York area the city. Well, or even just Manhattan. Like all of Manhattan is the city. Oh, we got to go into the city. Or if you're further out, when you go back to the city, yeah, I guess you're always referring to Manhattan, but it's not just like Wall Street area. Well, within London, this area, the City of London, it's walled. And I've been to London a whole bunch of times. I actually never went to the City of London, but this is where the banking industry is headquartered. And what is bizarre and very different than New York or any other city, except two other, hold on, is that the City of London has its own laws. Like they're not legally part of England. Like they're a sovereign, independent place. Now, I don't know enough about like how they have their own police force or how the mail works or any of that stuff, but it is very similar actually to the Vatican, which is also a sovereign nation within Italy that has its own sort of separate things. And interestingly, Washington, D.C. is kind of like that too. There's no representation of Washington, D.C. in Congress. It is its own entity. Now, I have been in Washington. They do have their own police force. They have their own sort of entity. You don't go through like customs or anything. But Washington, D.C., this is why I don't think they'll ever be, I don't think Washington, D.C. will ever be a state because it operates as its own separate entity, just like London. And this is where the banking cartel kind of originated. But eventually, people like to expand. And the British, who have a history of colonization, moved to the United States, and they also moved a banking operation that was set up in, I think, mostly New York. Now, when you kind of think about this sort of global banking, global finance cartel, there's a lot of factions. Obviously, we have this one that is based primarily in Europe. We like to affectionately refer to them as Davos because they meet So sort of they meet there in Switzerland annually. And it's, this is one club that the membership is a little bit fluid because there are actually literally organizations, groups like the Club of Rome that uh, do have a specific member list. But what we're talking about with these cartels is it's a little more kind of theoretical. I don't know exactly if there's a list of the people who are in the Davos Club, but we see some of the figureheads publicly, like our friend Klaus and people like Christine Lagarde, King Charles, and it generally represent the interests of the European nobility. We call them oligarchs, the really old money. These people generally hold like royalty positions within European countries. So somebody who would be like the king or queen of Denmark or the king or queen of Holland, Netherlands, these are generally grouped up into what we're going to call the European Davos oligarchy. Now we separately have a United States cartel, which for the purposes of today is going to be include the really rich people in the United States. So generally the Wall Street banks. And the Wall Street banks are part of their own cartel, which is called the Fed, which is a alliance of banks that sort of manage parts of the US financial system and monetary system. There are also other factions within the US, primarily the Washington kind of establishment. These are especially people who have been in political positions for a very, very long time. There are always new characters coming in. We have a president that changes role every couple of years. People come in and out of Congress. But there are quite a few people who work for organizations like the State Department and intelligence community that are sort of lifers, and they have a big role in this sort of Washington cartel. Then we have other nations that are quite influential, like Russia. Russia, global superpower, big economy, lots of resources. We have China, which is also global superpower. They are more industrious in terms of manufacturing, but they also have plenty of resources. Then there are other sort of countries around the globe that have, their own sort of family in the Game of Thrones. They're just a smaller region with less power and less influence. Brazil, South Africa, India, Canada. These are others. Australia. These are other sort of participants in this global faction. So I just want you to kind of like, if you've ever played that game Risk, just sort of in your mind imagine this sort of game board where you have all these nations, and just know that each region is going to have its own cartel faction. And sometimes these factions play nice with other factions. Sometimes they don't. And that's sort of what this global game of Risk, Game of Thrones, is really about for 2022 edition, is trying to figure out who's aligned with whom, what are the incentives that each person cares about, and what resources does each faction have at their disposal, and what's sort of the end game? What do we see happening with this, so that we can try to figure out like what's going on in the world. Now, the European cartel has been around a long time, and their MO for many, many centuries was colonialism. It's a great business model for them. What they do is they kind of go into a region. They did this in lots of African countries in the Middle East. Australia was originally a colony. Canada was originally a colony. United States, South America. Most of the world was at some point a colony of a European cartel oligarchy. And the business model is brilliant. You go in, you kind of take over, and you say, you have to give me a lot of your stuff. If you don't, we're going to do bad things to you. And I, as the owner of the colony, I do a whole lot of nothing except get paid. It's quite brilliant. It's evil. I mean, I don't plan to become a colonizer, but this particular oligarchy had this going on for a very, very long time. It was a very profitable business model. They were able to accumulate a lot of resources, which you then turn into assets, gold, land, etc. And what happened, though, was the Industrial Revolution kind of messed that up. And in the sort of movement of humanity to become modern and create machines and an industry and electricity and cars and all that stuff, it birthed this beautiful thing that I'm a part of, and probably you if you're watching this, which is called the middle class. And it kind of broke society from this caste system where everyone in the caste model, you're sort of born into a particular station in life, and you're kind of stuck, and you're not able to move. But the middle class, and specifically sort of this idea of the American dream and limitless opportunities in an industrialized nation, means that you could grow up in a poor circumstances, and if you do the right things, you can move up. There isn't a caste system in the US, as much as the media would like to convince you. I mean, I know plenty of entrepreneurs who come from very modest, poor, struggling circumstances. They were extremely motivated to overcome them. They worked their butt off and built pretty impressive businesses. Happens a lot. We love to watch movies about them, read books about them. They're often celebrated as heroes, sort of the Gary Vee types of the world. This is a problem for the colonizers because they like this system where they own everything and everybody else is like a servant who takes their time and effort and creates something that is given to this sort of oligarchy. So the middle class is a pain. We are disruptive. You could make so much money that you are now rivaling them, and maybe you own your own private jet too, which was originally sort of a privilege reserved for this royalty class. And crypto even was really sort of shocking in that a lot of sort of young people who hadn't done the hard work all of a sudden woke up and they were like, wow, I'm a multi-millionaire. And that created lots of opportunity. And you have to think about this old money class. They're arrogant. They have this belief that they are better than everyone else, and that they like this caste system, which means that you are supposed to stay in your station in life and not move up. Also, the middle class, generally, when you get a taste of that, you're not really interested in being anyone's servant anymore. You're like, I can figure out how to make my own money. I don't really want to go and have some job where I give you 75% of my yield or whatever. So the middle class has been a problem for this particular group. Now, some of the cartel factions around the world like a middle class. They benefit from it. So, for example, the US banking cartel, they like the middle class. They've kind of created these systems where they make tons of money from the middle class. So think about how, like a Citibank, right? So let's imagine you hypothetically had every account possible you could with Citibank. You might have a credit card where you rack up tons of spending and pay them. Let's say you don't pay it off every month, you pay them tons of interest. Then you might get a car loan through a subsidiary of Citi, so you're then paying them interest on the car loan. Or you have a mortgage, you buy a house, and you now pay them interest in that. There's like a whole bunch of ways that a thriving middle class is massively profitable for the US banking system. Now, the American system is quite different than other countries in that we love credit, we love borrowing money, we love financing things, we love living beyond our means, which I think was done intentionally by that system to encourage people to spend all this money in mechanisms that generate interest. Now, for the past couple of decades, actually, it sort of started very, very slowly, but in the last 2 years has become massively apparent. There's a power grab going on from the European cartel. And they have some public characters who will tell us we'll own nothing and be happy, and we're going to eat the bugs, and we can't go anywhere on a plane because we have to save the planet. There's sort of all of these societal measures that originate out of the European cartel that are essentially pushing people back towards a feudal structure where you'll own nothing and be happy is basically saying you're now going to become a servant, an indentured hired help working the land or working in a factory or doing some sort of job where you are underpaid and you're kind of a slave in some capacity. And the way this sort of power grab manifested is that the European cartel, in 2020, we had sort of this health issue. I'm trying not to get in trouble with YouTube here. We had this sort of health thing that led to the centralization of decisions. So this is a key thing to watch, that we had organizations like the WHO and the UN start to publicly push for one group, Coincidentally, they're all based in Europe with unelected European oligarchs who would now be in charge of decision making and policy. And while it looks like they're really about the thing, like the passport or the things you wear on your face or rules around distancing, like whatever all those rules were we were supposed to follow in 2020, they were really about money because a lot of nations, if not most nations, received substantial payments from this centralized entity to cover expenses and comply. There was a lot of money. You might even call them bribes that were given to countries. And I don't remember which nation it was, but there was like a smaller Eastern European country who didn't, like a Belarus type of thing, who that might not be it, but who the leader spoke publicly that he said no to the money because he didn't want to comply with the conditions for that money. And that was very suppressed. It was interesting to have seen that video, but it was clear that a lot of these nation leaders complied with mandates in exchange for payments. Now, I don't think the leaders kept all those payments for themselves. I'm sure that many of them went to other organizations, but I wouldn't be surprised if a chunk of that money made its way to the people who are the decision makers. I mean, this is how this kind of organized crime stuff works. All right, so that's sort of what 2020 initiated, was one faction of the cartel made its move. This is not too different than a mob movie where you have like the one family who's like, you know what, let's do it. We want to take over and be in charge of all the families. And the key goal here with this European cartel is they want to centralize three things. They want to centralize energy, they want to centralize food production, and they want to centralize money. This is why, number one, the climate agenda is really about moving the control of the energy from resource producing nations like the Middle Eastern countries, Russia, United States, Venezuela, to Europe when there's a shift towards nuclear power. The problem is that if they tell everybody right now we want to move to nuclear power, then people in other countries would just start building nuclear power plants and it would defeat the goal of the Europeans. So what they want to do first is distract everybody with windmills and solar panels, which is very clear if you do any kind of math that would be absolutely insufficient to power the current needs. You realize like it wouldn't work. Like no industry would be able to work with windmills. How are you going to have a car factory that melts metal do that with solar panels? Like forget about you and your house. There would be no more industry if you had to use windmills and solar panels. It just wouldn't exist. It's kind of funny to even say out loud. So the goal though is to shut down the fossil fuel dependent industries, make everybody suffer for a while, and then shift all of this back to Europe where they have built some nuclear power plants. Nuclear energy is very efficient. There's also sort of hydrogen powered cells that would become part of batteries in cars. That, my understanding from what I've learned, is kind of the future of where this is going. But they can't tell everybody that now, which is bizarre that more people aren't even asking about it. So just so you're clear, no one really is going to move to solar and wind as primary energy sources, especially for anything like industry. Like, are you going to fly in a solar powered plane or like a wind powered plane? Are you going to like have some kind of battery for your plane? How are you going to, let's even say you're going to fly a 5-hour flight from East Coast to West Coast. I'm not aware of any battery powered jet engines yet. So there's sort of a lot of gaps. Anyway, so that's part one, is moving control of the energy supply to under the European cartel. The second thing is they want to control the food supply, because the number one way to control a population of people is to control food. I mean, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we have lots of silly things to worry about in our modern life because I don't have any concerns that I'm not going to be able to eat today. If that changed, and all of a sudden now the vast majority of humans on the planet are concerned about where food is coming from, all of these other silly things that might distract us, like starting businesses and becoming a threat to the oligarchy, they go away. And we are now focused on, it's like Hunger Games. where a lot of these sort of poor divisions, what they were called, districts in Hunger Games, that was sort of one of their biggest concern, was simply food. That's not really what we're going to focus on today, though. The third thing in this is centralization of money. So you want to control the food supply, you want to control the energy supply. Well, you got to control the money supply. And he or she or it, whomever who issues the money, has a tremendous amount of power. And this is where the European cartel has a problem with the New York banking cartel, because the US dollar is currently the world's reserve currency, and the Fed and the US banks that are members of the Fed have a monopoly on printing US dollars. It's a very powerful ability, right? And this is why the Fed does not mess around with entities that try to print dollars outside of the banking system. This is a problem for the European cartel, right? Because they either have the US banking cartel be their subservient, or they have to shut down the dollar and move to a one world currency that they control. And the thing is, this is where understanding incentives matter. So let's just say, hypothetically, that everybody decided to move to this one world government, which of course would be headquartered in Europe, and this one world currency, which of course would be managed by the IMF, another European member of the cartel. That means then that the US banks now become subservient to the European banks, and they are like king of their turf. So think about these sort of Game of Thrones families. There was lots of problems in that show when you would ask one leader of a family to bend the knee to the other one, is that they don't all want to do it. We got a lot of alpha egos in this game of global cartels. Not all these alpha egos are willing to submit to another cartel faction. So Putin, for example, do you see him kind of bending the knee to Christine Lagarde or Klaus Schwab? I actually think there are people who are the decision makers above them who don't participate on media and TV. They prefer to remain behind the scenes. So those people are still alpha leaders. They dictate policy. And these other cartels, this is key. Like, it's not in their interests to participate in this European-led one world thing. They lose. And this is sort of the key to understand, is that the US faction owns commercial banks. JP Morgan, Citi, Bank of New York, Wells Fargo, big banks that make lots of money. If we were to move globally to this one world whatever system, where everybody gets our money directly from a central bank, a worldwide central bank, there's no more commercial banks. They're done. They would be cut out of the flow of money. Their whole business model of being the lender, the entity that you as a citizen have a relationship with, that you are the place where you borrow money, you're the place, the bank is where you get your credit card, that's all gone, right? Also, in feudalism, which none of us, please, you do not want to return to feudalism. Like, there is no upside for us in this. Unless you're one of the European oligarchs, which would surprise me because I didn't really think any of them watched my tiny little YouTube channel. Feudalism is not in our interests. The system we have right now, as flawed as it is, being able to be a middle class person is amazing compared to the alternative, which is to own nothing and not be happy, and to have no control over your money or your whatever, your resources, your autonomy. That's not a good deal for us. And fortunately, commercial banks don't want that either. Because remember, we went through all the things that commercial banks make money off the middle class. If everyone you know was impoverished tomorrow and lived in squalor, barely able to feed themselves each month, you're not going to be putting a new TV on a credit card. You're not going to be out buying a new car every other year. You're not going to be purchasing the most expensive home you can and getting this mortgage on it. It's over. The commercial banking industry and how they make money is done. Why on earth would a US commercial bank that right now has a really good thing going, why on earth would they give that up? And this is why incentives matter. And this is why I agree with Tom Luongo's thesis that there's currently a battle between the US cartel and the European cartel. It's primarily over control of the dollar. However, it impacts this implementation of this sort of Great Reset idea. Because if the Great Reset is successful and we all become feudal serfs and reporting into this European-led oligarchy, if that were to happen, then their industry is gone. Now, my first thought when I heard this thesis is like, well, what, wouldn't this just be more power for the US cartel and now they can rule over the whole US dominion? Who says that we all have to report into the European thing? Well, remember, one world government, you don't have factions. Everybody reports into this one thing. And there's there's a turf thing. It's like gangs. There's a reason why there's lots of gangs in a city. There aren't like hundreds of them, but there's more than one, because you're going to have these alphas who want to have their own turf. They don't want to report into somebody they consider their peer. It's just alpha ego stuff. So the leaders of the US cartel, who some of them may be behind the scenes, like I don't really know who Jerome Powell reports into ultimately, but that group is proving through their actions that they are not interested in being subservient. So while I think this makes sense theoretically, this is what the high interest rates that the Fed has been implementing are about. They are going to disrupt this market, this money market system in Europe called the Eurodollar market, which is how the European cartel is paying for all of their stuff. They also have been causing disruptions for the banks in Europe that this cartel owns. And even for some more direct evidence, you're seeing that the Wall Street crowd is really pushing back on ESG. This is a tell. Now, not all, there are some financial institutions associated with Wall Street that are part of this Davos crowd, like BlackRock, but they appear to be seeing that this is not a great thing for them either. So there's some waffling going on with BlackRock. But let's talk about Jamie Dimon, for example. This summer, there was a testimony hearing at the Congress, and Rashida Tlaib asked Jamie Dimon point blank if he would support reducing investment in fossil fuel things, which is basically like, are you on board with ESG? And he flat out, without hesitation, said no, that would be like the road to hell for the United States. Essentially, no, that's dumb. Why would I support that? Without hesitation, and clearly did not, if you want to know who the alpha was in that relationship, he clearly did not worry about speaking to her in that manner. He wasn't rude, but he was very direct, and he was not speaking up. He was either speaking down or at least best case as equals. So if the US banks are not on board with ESG, which is a key part of shifting this energy movement to Europe ultimately, it's a sign that they're not doing it. Jerome Powell has also publicly stated that there is no need in the US for a CBDC. And the Fed just tweeted out that there is no citizens of the United States do not have an account with the Fed. And Danielle DiMartino Booth, who is a Fed insider who is amazing at helping to translate some of the Fed's actions in sort of real world terms, I just on a podcast last week said that there will not be a retail CBDC in the United States because it would be the end of commercial banking, and there's no way the commercial banks in the US will allow it. So and we also see that Russia and China are not being subservient to Davos either. And this was evidence from China not doing the climate change Paris Accord thing, where they're supposed to pay this massive tax to these European leaders for, their carbon usage. And you can see that China's just like, I'm not doing it. Like, we're not going to be subservient to your grift that you have going, where you get to take over and be in charge of everybody. So I wanted to do this video because there are concerns from people that there's this conspiracy within the cartel for all of them to kind of collude and oppress all of us. And while I think that the European cartel is absolutely pushing for that, not all of these cartel members globally are on board. And there is just simply because it doesn't benefit them. And I don't think it's because any of these people are good necessarily, or that they care about us, or that they want us to have good things in life. It simply doesn't align with their own self-interest. So when looking at geopolitics and trying to figure out like what's going on, always seek to understand what is the interest of this group of people. And does a particular policy or rule or something serve their self-interest? Now, there are gaps in this. I don't understand why some industries are going along with ESG if it means the death of them. They may just have been blackmailed or paid off or otherwise corrupted. But the US banking cartel is very powerful in the United States. They have control over the money supply. Most dollars that are put into place are done through banks issuing loans. They have so that's a money printer. There's like a joke that the Fed is the money printer, but really the majority of money, actually, the Fed can't print money. The Fed prints reserves, which can be given to banks to print money. It's the banks that print money, and the banks that own the Fed. They're shareholders in the Fed. The Fed is a private entity that has shareholders. Now, not all the banks. There's sort of a group of banks that created the Fed back in 1913 that wanted to protect their own interests like a cartel. I do want to play you a Gary, actually we'll cover that in another video, but Gary Gensler used to work in the banking industry. He's now is head of the SEC, and he taught at MIT about blockchain stuff. So he understands crypto things very well. And there's a video where he kind of explains that the banking cartel will protect their own interests. Like they don't want innovation unless it's theirs. They want to slow things down. You know, if you are the entity that has a monopoly on something, why would you willingly give that up? So back to sort of this sort of great reset is, are the US banks on board? They would be giving up so much and what do they gain? They get to become subservient to another cartel. They lose their income. They lose their autonomy. For what? So this idea that like they're all in it together, it doesn't really break down well when you look at incentives. So that's all. Wanted to just cover that there certainly is a threat here, and we are probably in the middle of World War III. We're just not really in the global kinetic part. We're in a monetary war. We're in an information war. There's a lot of propaganda going around. It's very difficult to discern what's real and what's not. But I have no doubt at this point that there are multiple cartels at war with each other, and they're not all on board with the European-led agenda. And that actually might be a great thing for all of us, because if the Davos crowd loses their big power grab, then a lot of the dystopian things that they want to implement, they will not succeed. So, all right. If you enjoyed this video, please like it. I appreciate you subscribing to the channel, and follow me on Twitter if you're not doing that already, Molly Elmore 22. And I will see you in the next video.